In the last video, we talked about the basic syntax of JavaScript. In this video, we'll see how to use JavaScript to manipulate web pages in a browser. We'll also introduce a very important client-side JavaScript library called jQuery. Let's start with an example. We have a HTML page here, and this is what the source code looks like. Notice that this is just a HTML page. There's no servlet or JSP or any server-side stuff. If I enter a name here, for example, John, and click this button, the page changes to Hello John. And if I change this to Jane, for example, click this button and this part changes to Jane. Again, this is just a HTML page. There's no server-side code anywhere. So what's going on here? Well, let's look at the source code. We can see that the first part of the code is just HTML, which we are quite familiar with. The only new thing here is the onClick attribute. This attribute allows us to execute some code when this button is clicked. For example, it will call this function CHI. Click is called an event, and the code is called, of course, event handler. If we look at the HTML5 specification, we can see that it defines lots of events. Well, where are they? Oh, here, sorry. Yeah, this is a list of events. We can see that we have this click event and other mouse events like double click and things like mouse move, mouse over, and so on. And keyboard events like key down, key press, key up, and so on and so forth. So here is the event handler, and it's written in, of course, JavaScript. Notice that the way to embed JavaScript in an HTML page is to put the code inside a script tag. We can either write the code directly inside the script tag or use the source attribute of the script tag to link to a JavaScript file somewhere using a URL. Later on, we'll see how it looks like when we reference the jQuery library in a page. You can have multiple script tags in a web page. They should be either inside the head element or the body element. The common practice is to put script tags right before the closing tag of body. This way, when the JavaScript code is loaded, the HTML content of the page is already loaded, so your code won't run into errors when it tries to manipulate the content of the page. Client-side JavaScript code is often used to process and manipulate web pages. Like in the previous example, we first use JavaScript to get the user input in the text field, and then we use JavaScript to put it in the place after hello. Technically, we can process a web page, or in other words, a HTML document, as a text file. Doing so would be difficult and inefficient. If the HTML document can be represented by an object, on the other hand, it would be a lot easier to handle it in a programming language. This is where the idea of document object model comes from. Document object model, commonly known just as DOM, represents HTML documents as objects so they can be processed more easily by programming languages. The object representing this HTML document would look like this. The name of the object is called document, like document here. And this is why we have an object document here without needing to define such a variable. This document object contains all the elements in the web page. These elements are organized in a tree structure. At the root of the tree is the HTML element. An HTML element has two child nodes, head and body, like here. And then inside the body, we have a H1 element and a P element. And in the tree, they are here and here. Each of them also has their own child node, which is a text node containing some text. Because the elements are organized in a tree structure, we often use terms like parent, child, sibling, ancestor, descendants to describe the relationships among nodes/elements. The document object is created by the browser. After a browser loads a web page, it will parse it and create the document object, and we can then use it directly in our JavaScript code, like in this example. Also, very importantly, whatever changes we make to the document object will be reflected automatically on the web page. This allows us to manipulate a web page in a nice and easy way by simply changing the document object, again, like what we did here in the example. When you have time, please take a look at the API of the document object, which is here. So on the left-hand side, you can see that it has lots of properties and lots of methods that let us to find elements, modify elements, and create new elements, and so on. Here are a few methods for finding elements in a document. We can find elements by ID, by their name attribute, and by the name of the tag. Notice that getElementById returns a singular element, while getElementsByName and by tag name return plural elements. This is because ID is supposed to be unique, but name and tag name are not. In this code, we can see that we get the element with the ID name using getElementById, and it will return this span element which has the ID name. And we can assign it to a variable. Here, we use getElementsByTagName to get the input element, which is this one. GetElementsByTagName returns an array, Because we know there's only one input element on this page, we simply get the first item from the array, and we use the value property of the input element to get the value entered by the user. So after getting an element, we may want to modify it. Different browsers support different APIs, and some API are also element specific. For example, only form elements like input has a property value. In our example, we use the inner HTML property to change the content of the element, the span element. And this is why after we click button, we can change the content of the span element from an empty string to whatever entered by a user. And here are some methods to add, remove attributes, add, remove child nodes, and so on. And of course, we can create new elements and create new text nodes. Excuse me. Although the document API is pretty comprehensive, there are two problems using plain JavaScript. The first is that the code tends to be quite verbose, even for some simple tasks. And the second problem, which is much more serious, is that document API supported by different browsers are not entirely compatible. So although your code may work perfectly on one browser, it may not work on a different browser. The browser incompatibility issue was so serious and so frustrating that at one time I thought people were starting to give up on writing JavaScript. For a few years, people came up with lots of frameworks that let you write client-side code using other languages like Java and XML, and the framework would generate browser-compatible JavaScript code for you. But things changed when the JavaScript library jQuery came out. If you use jQuery instead of plain JavaScript, the library will make sure your code works on different browsers. And that's already a big win. But more than that, jQuery greatly simplifies DOM operations, event handling, and the use of asynchronous request and response. Currently, jQuery is the most widely used JavaScript library by a pretty large margin. So this website tracks about 91 million something other websites. And according to this website, jQuery is used by 78% of them. And as you can see, it's by far the most commonly used JavaScript library. If instead of looking at all 91 million websites, you only want to look at the large websites, for example, the top 1 million or the top 100K or the top 10K websites, you can see that jQuery is still the most widely used JavaScript library, though the percentages are lower, probably because many large websites are migrating to the so-called single-page application technologies like React, Angular, and Vue. But regardless, if you do web development, chances are you will encounter jQuery at some point. So in this video, we'll cover some important things about jQuery. If you remember, in CSS, We can use selectors to select elements to apply styles to. jQuery allows us to use the same selectors to select elements, which is more flexible than just select element by ID or select elements by name. Once we select some elements, we can apply additional conditions to filter them, and we can go from the selected elements to their parents, their children, their siblings, and so on. And this part is known as DOM traversal. Once we have the elements we want, we can get and set their properties, attributes, content, values, and their CSS class. We can handle events on those elements, apply some effects like fading and sliding on those elements, and insert, remove, replace, and move elements in the DOM tree. And on top of all this, jQuery also provides some utility methods and classes, including support for AJAX operations, which we'll cover in the next video. Because jQuery is a fairly large library, we won't have time to cover everything. In particular, we won't cover effects, filters, or DOM traversal. We will touch upon the other components in this video, and then in the next video, the AJAX operation support. For effects, filters, and traversal, I recommend that you check out the jQuery documentation or some tutorials for those subjects. Okay, so now let's take a look at the example using jQuery. This example, in fact, does exactly the same as the last example. Again, if we enter something, click a button, it will show up here, just like before. Now, if you look at the code, it looks quite a bit different than the last one. If you look at the last example, you can see that even though you may not be familiar with the DOM API, the code is still relatively easy to understand because it looks kind of like Java code. However, the jQuery version looks quite different and kind of confusing. The reason is that jQuery code is more concise and follows the modern JavaScript style that uses functions as objects extensively. At first, it may feel a little uncomfortable, but once you get used to it, you'll appreciate the combination of power and conciseness of jQuery. Let's first understand this $sign parenthesis thing, which we see all the time in jQuery code. This $sign parenthesis thing is known as a jQuery wrapper, but it's really just a function. Another way to call this function is to use the function name jQuery instead of $sign. But most people use $sign because it's more concise than typing jQuery. This function is very flexible. It can do different things depending on the type of the argument. In particular, if you pass a selector string to it, it will return the elements that match the selector. These are selector strings, and again, if you remember CSS, these are basically the same as CSS selectors, where we select elements by ID, by tag name, and by attributes. Now, if you, instead of a selector string, if you pass a HTML string to it, for example, if you pass something like h1, then jQuery will create new elements based on this HTML string. Let's first look at the selectors. As we can see, these are the same as the CSS ones. We can select elements by ID, just prefix the ID value with a pound sign or a hash symbol. We can select elements by their tag name, and we can select elements by the CSS class they have. For example, this one will select all the elements that has a CSS class called foo, and the CSS class selector starts with a dot. We can also select elements by attribute and by attribute that has a certain value, like this one. And again, like in CSS, we can combine multiple selectors together. If we concatenate them together, then the elements selected must match all the conditions. For example, this selector selects the div elements that has a CSS class foo and an attribute called bar. If we put the selectors together, separate them by commas, it means these elements selected only need to meet one of the conditions. For example, this selector will select all the div elements and all the elements that have a CSS class foo and all the elements that has an attribute bar. Now that we know the jQuery wrappers and selectors, it's easy to understand this code. So this one, for example, selects the button element, which is this element, and this one selects this input element by combining a tag name selector with an attribute selector, basically saying I want to select an element which is input element and it has a name attribute, and the value of the name attribute is called name, which matches this. And this one, of course, select the span element using a ID selector. Okay, so now we can select elements using the selectors, but what can we do with the selected elements? Well, we can do quite a lot. We can get and set the content of the elements both as HTML and as text. We can get and set their attributes and properties. If the element has a value, for example, if it is an input field, then we can also get and set its value. Note that in Java, we have different getters and setters, but in jQuery, getters and setters are actually the same method. For example, if we have an element E, then we can, if we say e.html, this will give us the content of the element E as a HTML string. If, however, we pass an argument to it, for example, if we say this, then HTML serves as a setter which sets the content of E element to this HTML string. Now, if we look at the example again, we can see that here we're using the val method to get the value of the input element. And here we are using the HTML method to set the content of the span element to whatever entered by the user. And in addition to all this, we can also add and remove CSS classes to the elements using methods like add class, remove class, toggle class, and check if an element has a certain class using has class. Now let's look at how events are handled in jQuery. In our first example, notice that there's an onClick attribute for button. But in the jQuery example, there's no such attribute for the button. The reason is that jQuery follows the practice of the so-called unobtrusive JavaScript, meaning that it tries to completely separate style, structure, and behavior of HTML document. Style, of course, should be in CSS. Structure is defined by HTML tags, and behavior should be in JavaScript. Because event handling is part of behavior, JavaScript moves it out of the tag and puts it in JavaScript code. As shown in our example here, now event is actually defined as a method on the element, and the event handler is an anonymous function passed to the method as an argument. Here, we are basically saying that for the click event on the button element, please run this function. jQuery defines a bunch of events, again, all as methods on elements. You have mouse events like click, double click, keyboard events like key up, key down, key press, and events for forms, events for browser windows, as well as events for the document object itself. You can check out the jQuery API documentation later to see all the events. But here we want to talk about one important event called document ready event. This event is triggered when the document object of the HTML page is fully constructed. This event is important because most client-side JavaScript code access the document object in some way. For example, selecting some elements, set the content of some elements, and so on. If the code tries to access a document object before it's ready, there will be an error. This event basically says the document object is ready, and this is why all the code that accesses the document object should actually be in the event handler of this event. Like the other events, the document ready event is defined as a method called ready on the document object. But because this one is used so often, it actually has a shorthand form. Instead of saying document.ready, then the event handler, we can simply say $ parenthesis and then the event handler function inside as an argument. And this is why our code looks like this. This part basically says when the document ready event happens, run this function, and inside this function we add click event handler to the button and so on and so forth. Okay, now that we know the basics of jQuery, let's do another example. Suppose we have a web page where we ask people what programming language they know, like this one. So originally there will be one input field, but some people know multiple programming languages, so we have a plus button here. If a user clicks on this plus button, we add another input field. And the new input field will come with a minus button. And if we want to remove it, we just click the minus button. Now let's see how we can implement this. So currently I only have some HTML text here, plus a little bit CSS styling. And if we click the plus button, nothing happens, of course, because there's no JavaScript. But first, let's quickly understand the HTML part. So I have a P element here, which displays the question. And then I also have a div, which contains all the answers. Inside the div, each answer has its own div, which has a CSS class called answer, and this allows me to add a little bit margin between those answers. And inside this div, we have an input field, and then we have a button called add with an ID add, and this is supposed to be the button we click to add new input fields. So far there's no JavaScript, but let's add some. The first thing we do is add the jQuery library, and you can get this code from the jQuery website. Basically, it allows us to link to the jQuery library and then later on use it in our code. So let me first copy over it here. And then we write our own code, and we use another script tag. Start with $ parentheses inside anonymous function. Again, remember this is the document ready event. Basically, we're saying when the document is ready, let's do things here. The things we want to do is, of course, we need to add a click handler to the plus button so that later on when we click on this button, it adds a new row. And we know this button has an ID called add, so whenever something has an ID, it's easy to locate. We can simply use an ID selector to select it. And then we add our event handler for the click event. To start with, let's just do a console log and say clicked, and make sure things are working. And if we click on it, we won't be able to see anything because console.log does not display anything on the page. What you can do is go to Developer Tools and go to the Console tab of Developer Tools. So here you'll see the console log output. In fact, we can see it right here. And if I click it again, you'll see another clicked. So far so good. When you write client-side JavaScript code, always have the developer tools open so that you can see the console log output, and also, very importantly, see if there's any error in your code. If you don't use developer tools, nothing gets displayed on the page. You don't know whether your code works or it doesn't work. Okay, so now we know this part works. Let's actually try to do something. So what we are trying to do is to add another row, and in here we see that each row is basically a div with a class called answer. So let's create one. We'll say, we'll call it new row, and this new row will be a div with a class called answer. Now, you may be wondering, why am I using $sign to wrap this thing up? Remember the jQuery wrapper. So we can use it to select existing elements, but we can also use it to create new elements by wrapping some HTML text inside, and this will create a new div element that later on we can add to the page. So once we have this, let's add the input and the button to it. So the input will look like this. So we'll say this one, let's call it new input. And it will be input type text, name is also answer, and we'll say a new button, and this time it's a minus button. So now we have a new row, which is a div, and we have an input element and a button element. So how do we put them together? This part is known as DOM manipulation in jQuery. If you look at the jQuery documentation, you can see there's a large section here about manipulation, and you can find methods to help you to insert into the DOM tree, around, inside, outside, removal, and so on. Around means you want to insert a new element as a parent of the current element, and inside means you want to insert it as a child, and outside means you want to insert it as a sibling node. And you can use remove method to remove selected elements. There are a bunch of methods provided by jQuery, so again, check out the documentation when you have time. The two most commonly used are probably append, which insert as a children or as a child, and remove, which remove the elements. So here, for example, we can say append new input. This will append input as a child of this new div element, and we can append this new button. And then we need to add this new row inside this one. This div has an ID itself, so once again, if it has an ID, it's easy to use. Just use the ID selector, and this one is answers, and I'm going to append new row to it. Okay, so let's see how it looks like. If I click this button, now we see a new row appears here. Click again, another one, and another one. Now, the problem is that, well, there are actually two problems. One is we probably want a little bit space between the input and the button, which should be easy to do by append a space here. And the second problem is that if I click a minus button, I want to remove this row. How do we do that? Well, again, it's just a click handler, right? So what we can do is we can say, for this new button, let's add a click event handler for it. And when somebody clicks on this new button, we want to remove this whole row, and that means we'll do new row.remove. And that should do the trick. Okay, so this is our first jQuery example. As you can see, once you know the basics of jQuery, it actually makes creating some interesting dynamic behaviors on a web page pretty easy. Now, let's look at another example. In this example, let's say we want to do something like a TType Token. We'll start with an empty 3x3 grid, and each time we click on a cell, we place either a X or O in it, kind of like the game tic-tac-toe. Of course, implementing a full tic-tac-toe game would be too much for this example, so instead we'll have a count button. And when we click on this button, it will display how many X and O's are currently on the grid. So this is the HTML part of the code. Again, no JavaScript, so if I click, nothing happens here. And I have a table here which has 3 rows and 3 columns, and just to make them space out and so on, I have a little bit CSS here, which does text align center, vertical align middle, and make sure the width and height are roughly 2 characters. So again, let's add jQuery first. Copy over this. And then add our code. Document ready event handler. Everything happens when the document is ready. So what do we do? Well, the first thing is we want to select these cells. And the nice thing about jQuery is that we can simply use a tag name selector to select all the cells. And then we can simply say click to add event handlers to all the elements selected. And inside the event handler, the selected element is represented by the object this. So let's say we want to set the text of this to X. And if we click, now you can see that we can do X. But of course, like TType Token, we want to alternate between X and O's. So maybe we can say turn symbol maybe X, and when we click, we'll put the current symbol there, and we'll say if symbol is X, we change it to O, and else we set it to X, something like this. And now you can see it alternates between X and O. Okay, so what if we want to do some counting? Well, if I click on count, I should count the number of X and O's in the grid, and that of course requires a click event handler. So this is a button element, and we only have one button element on the page, so we can simply say button. We'll use a tag name selector since there's only one, and we'll say click. Okay, so what happens inside here? Well, let's say we'll have count X to be 0, count Y to be 0, and then we need to go through each cell and see if it has X or Y. To get all the cells, we can use TD to select all of them, and then here's where we need to use another method called each. Now in jQuery, most of the jQuery object methods like click, append, and so on apply to each of the selected elements, like what we are seeing here. However, sometimes you don't want to use a jQuery object method, you want to run a function of your own. And if you want to do that, you can use the each method on the jQuery object and then provide your own function. So inside the function provided to each, just like in an event handler, you can use this to refer to the element. So here we'll do something like this. We'll say function and then each. So this one basically says for each TD element, and then we want to get the text of that element and check if it's either X or O. So we'll say if this text is X, we'll increment count X, and if this one is O will increment count O, not count Y. It's possible that the cell is empty, so in that case, it's neither X or O. So once we have this, we want to print out X and O counts. So we'll do, let's say we'll do a console log, why not? So we'll do a console log and say X is and O is something like this. Okay, so let's give it a try, and again I'm going to open up the developer console, refresh, no error here, that's a good sign, and I'll click XO and then X and O again and then X again and click count. It will say X is 3 and O is 2, which is indeed the correct count. If I give it another O, it will say X is 3 and O is 3. So this is another example which is not too complex. I want to use this example to show, well, to show several things. First is to attach event handlers to more than one elements. Again, notice that this one selects multiple elements, and we can attach event handlers to each one of them. And secondly is the each function and each method, and this allows us to apply a function that we provide on each selected element, like this. And as you can see, with fairly simple code, you can do, again, fairly interesting things. A few more things about the example and the, well, jQuery in general. So when we do $parentheses selector, we are actually getting back a jQuery object. And as I mentioned, a jQuery object may contain multiple elements, like multiple TDs. And most of the jQuery object methods, like click, append, and so on, apply to each of the selected elements. But if you want to run your own function on each element, you have to use the each method. Now, you'll probably notice that when we use this inside a function, we almost always put this inside a jQuery wrapper. And the reason is that this in an event handler or each function is actually a plain JavaScript HTML element. HTML element is different from a jQuery object. If we wrap $parentheses around a HTML element, it turns it into a jQuery object where we can apply all the jQuery magic by using methods like click, append, remove, and other stuff. So basically, know that this is an HTML element, and by wrapping it inside the jQuery wrapper, we turn it into a jQuery object / jQuery element with all the jQuery capabilities. Okay, so this is pretty much it for this video. Here's the link for the jQuery API documentation, and see you in the next video.